Okay, welcome to this screencast on Alexander the Great. So we're looking at him now acting as the king of Persia, having defeated Darius in the Battle of Gaugamela. But one of the first things our Alexander does was he actually sent home his Greek allies. So those Greeks who were fighting with Alexander, who were not Macedonian, Alexander sends them home. Now this is, I think, a clear indication Alexander is now no longer really acting as the hegemon of Greece, leading a pan-Hellic invasion of the Persian Empire. He is instead acting more like the king of Persia, and he will go on with his Macedonians. The rest of the Greeks can return home. With Parmenio, Alexander sends Parmenio back to Medea with loot for Harpalus, Alexander's treasurer. Now, Parmenio is nearly 70, and his instructions were to actually remain in Medea after handing over the loot. Now, this shows, I think, two things. First, Parmenio is still trusted by Alexander, as he's been sent with all the loot, but also it does get Parmenio out of the way. Because as I talked about, Alexander is now diverting. He is now seeing himself as the king of Persia, and he's going to start becoming more Persian and leaving the Macedonian idea behind. Parmenio would be completely opposed to this. And Parmenio is the old guard. He represents traditional Macedonian values, so to speak. And Alexander, thus, by giving him this mission, does get him out of the way. Parmenio would definitely have been against this policy of Alexander and would have come and obstructed that as much as he could. So this does help Alexander by getting Parmenio out of the way. Other personalities are Bagoas. Bagoas was, by all accounts, a beautiful eunuch, and he was a former sexual partner of Darius, and now he becomes a sexual partner of Alexander. Alexander completely falls for him. This also shows Alexander is becoming much more like a Persian king rather than a Macedonian king, because it's a very Persian thing to do, is to have eunuchs amongst your concubine. It's not really would have been seen by Macedonians as being what a real king would do. Bagoas, by all accounts, was a bit of a bitch, worked in the background there and was very influential in keeping power to himself and making sure that the way to Alexander was not easy. Alexander now sets to pursuing Darius. Remember, Darius fled from the Battle of Gaugamela, and he fled up to Ecbatana here in the east from Gaugamela. Darius' plan was to build another army to face Alexander, but that was just never going to happen. It's clear that Darius is no good, clear as yesterday's man. And he flees east once he hears Alexander has left Persepolis in pursuit, Ecbatana. Darius flees to the east. During the retreat from Alexander, many of Darius has been deserted, many left during the night. Some went to their homes, but a considerable number actually surrendered to Alexander. And Alexander was informed that Darius had been arrested by Bessus, who was the satrap of Bactria, also actually Darius' cousin. And Bessus had assumed power. He saw himself now as the king of kings, and that Darius has been handed over to Alexander. Bessus fled further east into Bactria itself, and Arrian says Alexander was in a relentless pursuit of Darius and Bessus. It was probably extremely concerned that Bessus was setting himself up as the new king of Persia, but also what's happening to Darius. And the death of Darius actually, I think, is pretty tragic. Someone who was so high has now fallen so low. Bessus' bodyguards stabbed him and left his body beside the road, beside a river. The wound proved fatal, as Arrian says, and Darius died. There's at least one of the Greeks, probably some scouts, not Alexander himself, came across the dying Darius, who asked for water. He was given that, and then he expired. There is a story that Alexander sort of spent the last moments of his life with Darius, but that's probably not exactly accurate. But this is really important for Alexander, because if Darius dead, again the gods smile on Alexander. Had Alexander killed Darius, he would have been sending the wrong message as the king of Persia, but all you have to do to be the king of Persia is kill the old king, and you become king. That's not what a new king wants to send out to his people. And conversely, if Alexander had to take Darius prisoner, then Darius alive would be, I guess, like a lightning rod for those who believed he was still the actual rightful king. And you would have had factions side of Darius, and you probably had civil war. So the gods are smiling at Alexander by Darius being killed, but not by Alexander's hand. About this time is the famous story of Thalastris, the Amazon queen, who spent 13 days with Alexander, desiring to have children by him, according to Justin. 13 days of good times in Alexander's tent, perhaps. Didn't work. She did not become impregnated by Alexander and returned to her kingdom, and later died. Just a little story. It's a mythical story, but it does, I guess, show how Alexander is, again, part of other legends with the Amazonian queen. Over the Hindu Kush flees Bessus, a very inhospitable mountain range, and Alexander relentlessly pursues him. And Alexander did not plan this expedition, and as a consequence, his men met fatigue, frostbite, snow, blindness, hunger, and altitude sickness. And in fact, they would have died unless they'd eaten the meat raw, and local tribes gave them a herb, a local plant, to help them not become sick from eating the meat of the horses. All this time, Alexander was unflagging. He was encouraging. He was keeping on going, walking beside his men. And we see Alexander essentially becoming like a hunter, because Bessus has realized that this is not good, and he's running like hell. And he burns everything behind him, then slash and burn, trying to slow Alexander down by no supplies to feed his men. But Alexander just keeps on coming. It's a terrifying apparition, I think, now. And Bessus is absolutely terrified that Alexander is going to catch up with him. And this is sort of the image that we see of the terror of Alexander spreading. Bessus flees through the desert, heading for the river Oxus. He crosses the Oxus. He's in his homeland, he's in his hometown. He doesn't believe that Alexander can possibly follow him in the desert. This looks like being true, and Alexander's men run out of water, and they get stuck into the wine, which makes things worse, because not only are they hugely dehydrated, they're drunk. They reach the river Oxus, and many of Alexander's men died because they just drank water too quickly. So you see Alexander's leaving bodies behind him as he is just pursuing this man. Pursued him through the desert. He now crosses the river Oxus using the same tactics when he crossed the Danube, with straw between the canvas tents, creating a flotation device. And so we've got Alexander is pursuing Bessus over landscape, through the deserts, over rivers, over mountains. He is coming. He is remorseless. I've been chased by a phantom. Bessus heads into his homeland of Sogdiana. He thinks, surely I'm going to be safe here. But he's not. Terrified, one of Bessus' men, Spotamenes, arrests Bessus and sends word to Alexander that he has Bessus. Alexander sends Ptolemy, one of his good friends and generals, to bring Bessus to him. And we talked about Bessus was tortured in Persian style, so his nose was cut off, his eyes were gouged out, his ears were cut off, his tongue was pulled out from the roots, and then his penis was cut off and shoved into his mouth. That's the torture. And the Persian style of execution, the two young trees bent down, Bessus' body tied to them. We have a nice fireworks display. And it is Persian style because, remember, Alexander is the Persian king. He's seen in the message that he's a Persian king. He's doing things the Persian way. Spotamenes flees. He's terrified of Alexander as well. A local tribe takes him in, the Massagetae, but then they heard Alexander was coming, so they chopped off Spotamenes' head and sent it back to Alexander. So look, here we have Alexander. He's so feared. He's terrified. He's like a phantom coming through your night, you know. That's what I talked about with Michael Wood and his duties, that local grandmothers told her they kept the children quiet by saying, if you don't go to sleep now, Alexander will get you. And he is, I love this phrase, a long-haired demon from the race of Wrath. Here he comes, revenge, and it's Alexander leading it, and he will not give up. I've been chased by him, it's been chased by your nightmare. So there we go. That's our screencast for today. Hope you enjoyed it. We've got a bit of a war crime to look at next time. Ka kite.